Hello, this is Basar. In this tutorial, we are going to implement the validation logic in an Express application. The code repository for this tutorial is right here, this Express Centralized. And here we have a couple of branches right here. I've been making my tutorials on the same project, and so far we have seen the CRUD operations, we have the error handling, we have the middleware implementation, we have pagination, then we have this structure change in the application. Now we are going to build validation, and the starting point is this branch, and we will be implementing the things we are going to see in this tutorial are right here in this validation final branch. So you can clone this repository and switch to the branch validation start and follow the steps with me. The project is opened in VS Code, and let's go over the structure first. So in this package.json, we have these dependencies Express, Centralized, and SQLite. And we have this node mode dependency for running our application in watch mode. So whenever we have any changes in our files, the application is automatically restarted. And here in this index.html, we are initializing the application, and the main application logic is right here in the app.js. We have the routers for the user and article, and also we have this error handler. So if you would like to see what we have done so far, please check the previous tutorials about this Express application. And in this user router, we have this endpoint for posting user, and currently we don't have any validation when we are sending the request. So let's demonstrate the problem first. Let's run the application, opening a terminal right here and running npm start. This application was creating a couple of users and articles initially, but in Postman we can send a request. So this is a valid user request, but let's try something like this one. Let's send empty values for username and email. So we are receiving success response back. We sent multiple times and we are still receiving the success response back. So if we get the user list, there are two pages. Let's go to the next page, page 1. And here in this page, we are seeing these users having empty username and email. So with the validation, we will not allow these kind of entries to be inserted to database. So let's implement that. For this case, we are going to use a library. This library is called as Express Validator. And first, let's install this one. Going back to our console, killing the application. Now, running npm install save Express Validator. So the package is installed. Now running the application once again. Now let's do a couple of changes. For now, we are not going to need the users or articles, so just removing this part from index.js. We are just making sure the database is initialized with no data in it. So also removing these user and article models from this index.js, saving this one. Let's get all users, again sending it to this user's endpoint, and here we are seeing empty user table. Now let's start with this part. For the username, let's not allow empty username to be set for this user. So let's fill the email with a valid email like this one, user1@mail.com, but for the username, this is going to be empty. Currently, this is accepting the request. Here it is returning success. And if we get this endpoint here, it is listing the users. But now we are going to reject this request. When there is empty username in the request, we will be rejecting this one. And we will do it in user router right here. And we are going to use our dependency. So we will get a couple of functions from that dependency, and that dependency is Express Validator. And the functions we are going to get is body. This is a function for checking the request body. Request body fields will be controlled with this function. And the next one is this function validation result. Previously, we have seen how we can use middleware in the route handlers, and this body is also a middleware. So here we can add our middleware right here in this post definition. So the first parameter is the path, and we have this middlewares defined here. Then the last one is our actual route handler function. So for this case, we will be checking in body. There will be username, and this body has functions like this one, not empty. So we are expecting this username coming in the request body to be not empty. And this middleware function will be running, then our request handler will run. And in this request handler, we can check if this request is valid or not by running this. This validation result is looking for this request object. And if there are errors, about the validation, then we can get them like this. So basically this body is updating the request object, and this validation result is taking this request object and checking if there are errors in it, which can be set by this body function. Previously we have done same thing with this pagination. Here in this pagination middleware, we are checking the query parameters, and we are updating the request object having this pagination object. And here in the router of the get users, we are taking this pagination from the request. So similar to that one, this body is updating this request object, putting the validation results into it. Then here we are taking those values via this function, validation result function, coming from the Validator library. And this returned object, this errors, has functions of if errors is empty. So for our case, we are looking for errors to be not empty. So this means there is validation errors. So we can send a response. We are returning at this line. So the next part will not be run. So we are going to return a response, and let's send the errors objects is having the validation failure information, and we take it from errors array function. Now saving this one and sending a post request from Postman. Here we are receiving this message, this array, and there is one object in it, and in this object it is having this message invalid, and it has this parameter, and this is for the username. So it is saying basically the username has invalid value, and here it is also printing out the actual value, and here is also it is printing where this field is located. So just like sending empty value, we can set null for username, and let's see what's going to happen. And here we can see the value is null because we are sending username is null, and the rest of the message and the params are same. So the validation is working. We are making sure the username is not null, not empty. But let's update our response. Currently we are returning 200. Okay, but let's update the message and the response status for this case. So we can set our own message like this, putting this body to new line, and here body username not empty, and we can set message for this one like this with message, and for this case we can say username cannot be null. And also let's update the status. Here we are checking the errors and returning the error spec. So let's set the status as 400, bad request, HTTP status code for the bad request, and we are returning this array once again. And let's see the result. Here sending the request, and here we are seeing our own custom message. Now let's add a validation for this email. Let's send an email with wrong format, so there is no @ sign in it, so this is not a valid email. Sending this one. Currently it's not validated, only the validated part is this username. So let's add another validation. We can add multiple validation middlewares like this. So the first one is for username, and let's add another one right here. This is for email field in the body, and like this not empty, it also has is email. And we can set message for this one too. Let's say must be a valid email address. Saving this one and sending a request. Now we are receiving two objects, one for this username with this message, and the other one is for email with the message we are setting for that case. We can also do multiple validation on each of these fields. So other than checking the not empty case, we can check for the size limitations. Like for instance, we can say adding this one to another line. So first we are checking if this body is not empty, then we can also add is length function, and this is for checking the length of the username field coming in this body, and it is taking options, and this options object we can define min and max values, and let's say the min value is 4 and the max value is 32, and let's say the message is username must have min 4 and max 32 characters. So saving this one, and let's try it with Postman. So we are going to send a username, but let's send just a single letter, and here we are receiving this message. The username must have minimum 4 and maximum 32 characters. But if we send an empty request like this one, we are receiving two messages for username field. One is for the not null case, the empty case. Other is for the size case. And if we try with the null, the same result is also happening. And that is because this part, the control part for this username, it is running this one, but also it is running the next one. So both of these are resulting to separate error cases. But for user point of view, we can just return the first matching failure. So if this is null, if this is empty, then we don't need to check the length of it because it's already invalid. So when we are using multiple validations for a single field, we can stop the process whenever it finds an invalid condition. And we can do it like this way. We chain these validations together with bail function. So whenever this one is happening, then it is bailing at this point and not doing the next validation. But if it's not that case, if it's not empty, then it is continuing with the next validation function. So saving this one, and let's try it Postman. So it is null and sending a request. Now we are receiving only this username cannot be null message. But if we just send a single character, then we are receiving the next validation case, which is the length for this username. This Express Validator has built-in functionalities for checking the not empty, the length, or the email cases, but also we can define our own custom functions. So for instance, we can say the email in this application must be unique, so there cannot be two users having the same email address, and we can do that validation like this. So other than checking if this body is if this email in the body is really an email, then let's bail. If it's not, let's bail. But if it is email, then let's implement our own custom functionality for the uniqueness validation. And we do that by calling custom, and this is having a validator function. This function is taking parameter, and that parameter the actual value coming in the email field in the body. So let's take that one, email. Now we need to query our database to check if there is a user, and we implemented our user model related functionalities in this user service. So let's add another function to this one. Let's say there will be a function find by email, and this is going to be taking the email value, and it is going to be returning this user model as find one function, and it takes where, and the field we are looking for is the email in the database table, and the value must be the email value we are having here. In other functions we have used async await, and this is a promise, so we can either go like this or turn this one into async await. So we await at this line, this is returning back the user, and let's return user back. And let's also changing the function name, let's also make sure we export this function. So here in this custom implementation, here we are using the user service in this user router, so that we can get user service find by email. Again, we can use the async await here, async await. So this is going to be returning user or undefined. So if it returns a user, that means there is a user with this email, so we need to fail at this point for the validation. So if there is user, if it has value, then it is true. Then for making sure this validation to be kicking in, we are going to throw an error, and we can set our message like this: this email is in use. Now let's save all these changes and let's open Postman. Now we are going to send valid request, so user1 and user1 at mail.com. So this is valid, this is success, and if we check the database, we have corresponding user, and sending the request once again. Now it is failing with this email is in use message. So this validation, this custom validation is working. It is finding the user and is throwing an error, and this message, just like we are setting a message for this email case, is set as message for this condition, and we are receiving that one in this errors array. So basically this is how we can use the Express Validator to do validation when we are receiving the request. It's not just limiting the validation functionality to the body, it can also do validation for, let's check, the header, the query parameters can be validated, or cookie. And if we want to validate, let's say we have this username is visible in multiple places, like either body, in query parameters, like that, then instead of using these specific places in the request, we can use the functionality of check and replace this one with check, and this one too. So this would be checking this username in body, in request parameters, in the cookie, in the headers, and if it finds this, it validates that value with these conditions, and so that we would be able to do this validation regardless of this field's position. So you can check the documentation of this validator and check the functionalities here. Here we have the check function, and here it is listing where it is looking for those fields. And we also have the body, and the others are listed here. And also there are a couple of more functionalities here which can be useful for your specific use cases. Now, just undoing this part and using the body once again. Now in this application, we are using centralized error generation like this one. Let's open the Postman once again. If we try to access a user like this, the user is having ID, which must be a number, but let's try to access with a letter. And here we are receiving this error message with this format, having the message, timestamp, and the path. Now let's turn this validation error result into something similar, and we can do it with throwing exceptions. And for instance, for this ID control, we were checking if the ID is really a number. If it's not, we are throwing this invalid ID exception. And also we have this user not found exception, which is thrown when the user is not in the database. Here in the user service, we are trying to get the user based on this ID, and if we cannot find the user, we are throwing this exception. And this is leading a status of 404 with this message. So let's try this one. We are getting, let's say the user ID is this one, and here we are receiving the 404 with this message. And rest of the response body is filled in here, error handler right here. It is taking the error object, taking the status, taking the message from this error object, and also adding a timestamp and path to the response body it is sending. Now, just like this one, we can have another exception. Let's create one here. So this is going to be for validation exception. And it is going to be similar to the, let's say, the not found exception. So this is going to be validation exception. And in validation exception, the status will be 400. And the message, let's say the message will be invalid request. Now we also need to show the user which fields are failing with the validation. So let's do it like this. So we have this username field is failing with with this case, and the email is failing with this one. So other than this format, we will be also adding those validation results, and we can do that like this. This validation exception can have another object. Let's call this one as errors, and let's have it here. The errors will be errors we are passing in this function parameter, and let's use this in user router. So here in this router for the user post, instead of generating our response right here, let's send an exception to the next handler. So first let's get the validation exception, and we will require it from one directory above. Under shared, we have this validation exception. So instead of returning a response like this, we are going to delegate this exception to next. So this function is taking the next. This route handler is taking the next, and we are returning at this point and calling next with new validation exception. and this is looking for errors, and it is coming from errors array. So let's save these changes and let's try it here. Now we are sending an invalid post request, and here we are receiving this bad request with this message, with this response body having invalid request. So the 400 and the invalid request are coming from this validation exception, but also this exception has this error. So in our error handler, other than the status and the message, we can get the errors part. So let's do it like this. Let's have them here. I'm using object destructuring from error, so we get status and message, so we don't need to reference error right here. And we also have errors, which is part of this exception too. But this exception handler function works in every exception cases, and in the other exceptions like the user not found or invalid ID exception, we don't have errors in them. Let's display this one in the response too. So adding errors right here, and let's save this and let's send a request. Now we are returning a response with this validation result, and also in the errors part we are displaying corresponding errors in them. But let's change the format of these errors. It is not easy to distinguish which field is having what kind of validation failure. So we only care about this part. The username field is failing with this message, or the email field is failing with this one. So in the clients, the process of that kind of response would be easier. So let's change this errors object into our own custom way. So here, this errors will not be always visible. For instance, this errors is coming with this validation exception, but in user not found cases, it's not there, or it's not there in the invalid ID exception. So, and here we are going to check if there is errors. Then we are going to loop through the errors with for each, and in each iteration we will get error object, this one for instance, and we will take the parameter, the param, and the message from it. So we are going to create a new object. Let's have an object right here. Let's call this one as validation errors, and it's going to be undefined initially, and if we have errors, let's make sure this is an object. So in each iteration of this errors array, we will be updating this validation errors. So this validation errors will have a field, and that field is coming from error param, and it has a value. It has the value of error message MSG, and instead of using the errors in the response, let's use validation errors, saving it, and in Postman sending the request. Here we are receiving these validation errors, and it is saying username must have this characters and email must be like this. And if we look for a non-existing user like this one, again we are receiving the same error object. In this scenario, it is throwing user not found exception, and here in the error handler, since that exception does not have errors in it, this part is skipped. This validation errors is undefined, therefore it's not part of the response body. So that's it for this tutorial, and that's how we can do validation with the Express Validator in the request, and that's how we can create our own generic error response for these cases. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you in the next tutorials.